Structure of poetry. Dear students, what is poetry? William Wordsworth says poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. Everyone likes poems. I am sure that when you think back to your first days of schooling and your kindergarten days, you think of rhymes like twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are, up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. Actually, it is a full-fledged poem with 3 full stanzas, and only first stanza is taught to little children as a rhyme. And another rhyme goes like this: row, row, row a boat gently through the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. It contains a philosophical meaning. These rhymes are some simple forms of poetry. Over the years of your schooling and your higher education, you would have read more complex forms of poetry of Robert Frost or Milton. Frost says, "Woods are lovely, dark and deep, I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep," having inner meaning about human life. John Milton says, "Mind is in its own place, it can make a heaven of hell and hell of heaven." We enjoy reading and reciting poems. Do you know what the structural components of poetry are? Let us discuss about this in this session. The word poetry is derived from an ancient Greek word poio, which means I create. I am sure that when you think of poetry, you are not only think of language, but also art. Poetry has been long heralded as a form of human language, which is well acclaimed for its aesthetic qualities, the semantic content, as well as its structural notion. Poetry differs from ordinary prose and is presented either orally or as literary creation by using a multitude of language forms. Poetry uses condensed and compressed form to convey different emotions and ideas to the reader or to the listener. Therefore, the interactive layering of such different effects give rise to an effective poem. Let us examine such elements of poetry and the various components involved. By the end of this session, you will understand that the connotations and the weight of the words along with the associated shades and nuances will help in an effective interpretation, leading different readers to hear poetry differently. Would you like to know the structural elements of a poem? The basic structure used in any poem largely varies with the type of poem. It is observed that all poetry has certain structural elements. These include the line, the couplet, strophe and the stanza. All of these elements are used wonderfully by poets to create a piece of imaginative and creative work. The line of poem is not actually a sentence. From your previous lessons on the structure of a sentence, you know that a sentence is called as one only when it is complete. However, a line of poetry is often incomplete and completes only in the next line. It is important that while understanding poetry or writing it, the breaking of lines is given importance. In poetry, a line does not end when the sentence ends, and there is no need for a full stop or a comma at the end of every line. The breaking of lines in the poetry is important as it speaks to the pace, mood and rhythm of the poetry. For example, consider the following lines of a poem. What peaches and what benumbres, whole family shopping at night, aisles full of husbands, wives in the avocados, babies in the tomatoes. The aim of splitting the line whole families shopping at night is to give emphasis to the words themselves so that the reader will pause at the end of every exclamation mark. The second structural element of any poem is couplets. Couplets can be identified very easily in poetry. Every couplet is made up of two lines which share a common end rhyme. The presence of a couplet helps in introducing a complete thought at a time. Most couplets have been used in early English literature. The most commonly found couplets are in Shakespearean literature and can be used at the end of sonnets to conclude ideas. How like Eve's apple doth thy beauty grow, if thy sweet virtues answer not thy show. Even without knowing the contents of the entire sonnet, the couplet provides the reader with some important information about the poem. From the above couplet, it is understood that the poet is writing a poem about the beauty of a woman. Strophe. The strophe is often used interchangeably with a stanza, but can be differentiated due to its nature of construction and function in the poem. The strophe is a group of lines or verses to form a distinct section of the poem. It is important to note that a strophe does not have consistent patterns of rhyme or meter and is most commonly used in free verse poetry. What is a stanza? A stanza is made up of two or more lines of poetry which often go together to form a single division of a poem. Every poem has similar length stanzas and can be compared to the elements of a story. Stanzas can range from 2 lines to many. If the stanza is 2-lined, it is a couplet. If it is 3, then it is tacit, and when it is 4, it is a quatrain. For example, do not go gentle into that good night, old age should burn and rave at close of day, rage, rage against the dying of the light, is a 3-line poem. Therefore, it is clearly seen that the poem can have any of the above structural elements including line, couplet, strophe and stanza. Let us now discuss the forms of the poetry. The physical structure of a poem is presented as its form. The form of the poem can be looked upon as the length of the lines, the associated rhymes, repetition as well as the system of rhymes. The type of poem and its features to identify the underlying patterns is therefore described by using the form of poetry. Another sense of form is the identification of familiar patterns. For examples, patterns can be single and open-ended as seen in blank verses, and they can be quite complex as seen in rhymes with repetitive lines, fixed lines and rhythms as seen in sonnets. So, my dear students, let us now examine the different forms normally used in poetry. Acrostic form. An acrostic poem is a poem which uses the first letter of every line to identify any word or phrase. It is common to find a word or a phrase through the center of a poem. Sometimes, in such cases, the acrostic is referred to as a monostic, or at the end of the lines when the acrostic is referred to as a telistic. Sometimes the poem is also written in a manner wherein the first and the last letters of the poem are found to write out a message, such as a poem is called as a double acrostic poem. For example, consider a single poem on the sun. Shines brightly up in the sky, nice and warm on my skin. This poem has the word sun identified from the first letters of every line. Center form. When a poem is made up of lines from other poems, then the poem is referred to as a center. This is identified from an Italian word called a patchwork, or is often called as a technique instead of a form. It can be thought to be of different lengths and does not necessarily rhyme. The following poem is an effective example of center. Much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. John Keats, on first looking into Chapman's Homer. But still I long, Alison Chisholm, to learn tales, marvellous tales of ships and stars and isles where good men rest. James Elroy Flecker. The Golden Road to Samarkand. How others fought to forge my world. Alison Chisholm. The above lines have been taken from different poems. The first line is taken from John Keats, the second and the fourth line by Alison Chisholm, and the third line by James Elroy Flecker. Clerihew The third type of form is called as a clerihew form. This form is a four-lined poem and is often referred to as an AABB poem. The first line gives the subject of the poem, and this poem has a form which is highly irregular in nature. An example of a clerihew is given below. Sir Humphrey Davy abominated gravy, he lived in the odium of having discovered sodium. As you can see, it is four-lined in nature. Double dactyl form. This type of form is normally used for verses called as nonsense verses. In this form of poems, there are a total of 8 lines, each consisting of 2 dactyls. The first line is a nonsense word, higgledy-piggledy. The second is usually a name with other line rhyming in nature. Higgledy-piggledy, Benjamin Harrison, 23rd President was and as such, served between Clevelands and save for this trivial idiosyncrasy didn't do much. Rhythm in poetry. Rhythm is identified as the different patterns of sound which are made often by varying the stressed and the unstressed syllables in any given poem. Rhythm in poetry has a patterned recurrence within a certain range of regularity. Rhythm, while difficult to define, can easily be identified by the ears and the mind. The rhythm is found to have qualities of movement, repetition and pattern to give the temporal structure to any given poem. Many poetic experts have argued that the rhythm is most essential to poetry as it helps in heightening the emotional response and affords the readers with a sense of balance. When English poems are considered, rhythm can be identified based on 5 different forms. The first type is called as an lambic, example collapse. Rhythm which has a single unit of one stressed syllable and one unit of unstressed syllable. The second is called trochaic, example pizza, when the unstressed syllable precedes the stressed syllable. When the rhythm has only unstressed syllables, it is called as a spondaic rhythm. If it has 2 stressed syllables and the one unstressed is anapaestic, that is but of course, and if it has one unstressed syllable and 2 stressed ones, it is called dactylic, example honestly. Every unit is called as a foot based on the number of foots that are there in any given line of a poetry. A meter is defined. If a line has 1 foot, it is called as monometer, 2 it is diameter and so on. Unlike rhythm, meter is not a prerequisite for any poetry. It is identified to be an abstract organization of elements which enables identification of stress, duration and the number of syllables per line. The use of metrical patterns in conjugation with other sound patterns helps in producing tension or counterpart. To explain the above concept, consider the following example. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. The above line is from a sonnet by Elizabeth Browning. It is seen that all the above line is made up of iambic feet, which are 5 in number. Therefore, this is called as an iambic pentameter. Most formal poetry has an iambic pentameter as the primary structure. The process by which the above line was analyzed is called as scansion. Scansion is a process which is used to describe the rhythms of poetry by dividing the lines into feet and thereby marking the locations of the stressed and the unstressed syllables. This can therefore help in counting the syllables. It is seen that when there is a large number of lambic and anapestic meters in a given line, then it is called as rising meter as it moves from unstressed to stressed. On the other hand, when trochaic and dactylic meters are used, then they are called as falling meters as it moves from stressed to unstressed. It is seen that while lambic and anapestic meters are used for classical and serious poetry, anapestic and dactylic are often used for comic poetry. For example, bats have webbly wings that fold up, bats from ceilings hang down rolled up. The above line has a dactylic form and is used to cover comedy. Complexities of form and rhythm. Points indicate that the rhythm and form can be altered by the use of certain structural elements. These include the use of cassure enjambment and change in rhythm for emphasis. This section will provide details of each of these complex elements. The first element is a cassure. A cassure is defined as a visible break or pass in a line of poetry. This is often promoted by using either punctuations or by using empty spaces in the poem. The use of such features helps in signifying a pause which is required while reading that line of poetry. Such elements are used to help change the rhythm of the line. The adoption of the cassure changes the final pattern of the line and was most useful when writing olden day ballads. For example, consider the following ballad. Sigmund's glory grew and grew because of his courage when he killed the dragon, the guardian of the hoard, under grey stone. From Seaman Heney, translation of Beowulf, lines 884 to 886. From the above lines, it is seen that there is a need to pass between the lines. Such ballads were often given musical tunes, and when the singer embarked on the stories of brave warriors, the presence of cassure helped them pass and give more emphasis. The second type of structural form which impacts the rhythm of any given poetry is the use of enjambment. The use of enjambment is to change the oral rhythm of poetry. In poetry, an enjambment is the break of a syntactic unit or a clause which is split over two or more lines without a punctuated pass. An enjambment can be used to delay the intention of the line until the following line is read by the reader. Such an approach builds on the expectation of the reader and the hopes to surprise them. For example, consider the following lines from the poem, The Rape of the Lock. On her white breast a sparkling cross she wore, which Jews might kiss and infidels adore. It is seen from the example that on the first read any reader would get confused. The first question that comes to your mind is, why would a Jew adore a cross? But when you revisit the line, you understand the satire and the humor involved. The author here refers to the fact that despite the religion of a man, he would like to get close to a woman. Apart from this, the enjambment can be used to rhyme with other words. Consider the example. The four engineers wore orange braziers. To make the lines rhyme, the word engineers has been split into two. Finally, a change in rhythm is used for emphasizing any given point. For example, a poem which has an iambic pentameter throughout its entire length can change its rhythm in the final couplet. Consider the poem by Shakespeare. That music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go, my mistress, when she walks treads on the ground, and yet I think my love as rare as any she belied in false compare. All other lines have an iambic pentameter. However, in the final couplet, the first line has 8 syllables, while the second has 10. This is to change the rhythm and match the speaker tone. The aim is to stress that the speaker really does love his mistress. Reading structure of a poem. We have seen in detail about how anyone can structure their poem. Now, we will have an insight into how a poem can be read. It is important that certain basic steps are followed while reading the poem. This is as important as understanding the structure of the poem. The first step is to understand the basic structure of the poem. To do this, the title and the poem subject has to be analyzed. It is important to analyze them to understand what information is obtained with respect to the tone, the genre and the subject. It is also important to understand the basic situations of the poem. The narrator of the poem, the story and the tangible being described has to be understood. Following this, the reader should look at the type of poem in terms of comparison or analogy. The attitude of the author is also to be understood to identify if the poem is irony, satire and humor, death, serious or relevant in nature. Having understood the basic structure of the poem, the next step is to consider its context. In the analysis of the context of the poem, the reader should identify any associated allusions to literary or historical figures. The reader should also relate the poem to the basic background of the poet. For example, the poem "The Road Not Taken" was written by Frost in response to the choice of his career. An understanding of the poem in turn leads to an understanding of the poetry. Following this, the form of the poem is to be studied. The reader should look for sound, rhythm, meter and form. Does the poet use rhyme? What do the meter and rhyme emphasize? Is there any alliteration, assonance, onomatopoeia? How do these relate to the poem's meaning? What effect do they create in the poem? By understanding these concepts, the reader understands the very basis of the poetry, and this helps in understanding and writing a critique on the poem. The next step is to look at the word choices of the poem. This will help in understanding the mood of the poem and the form of language in the poem. If the language of the poem is abstract, then it can refer to intangible things. However, if the language of the poem is concrete, then there is identification of tangible aspects. It is also important to identify if consistent patterns of words are used. When examining the word choice of a poem, it is also important to identify if figurative language is used. This will help to identify if metaphors are used in the poem along with the use of hyperbole or paradox. Therefore, by examining the structure, context, form and word choice of a poem, a reader can perform a detailed analysis of the poem. In conclusion, I would like to say, through the entire topic, the form of poetry, its structure, the associated rhythm and complexities are understood. The topic has also given a clear description of how a reader should analyze the poem. It can be concluded that understanding the structure of the poem contributes towards understanding the emotions behind the poem and the thoughts of the reader. To recap, we can conclude that any poem can have different forms including acrostiche, cletho or didactic. Every poem is made up of lines, couplets, strophes and or stanza, and these four parameters form the basic structure of a poem. Following this, the rhythm of the poem is to be understood. The rhythm is important as it provides context to the poem. Many poetic experts have argued that the rhythm is most essential to poetry as it helps in heightening the emotional response and affords the readers with a sense of balance. The rhythm of any poetry is identified from its units, feet and meters. The complexities of poetry, on the other hand, can be identified using the caissero, enjambment and the rhythm for emphasis. It is concluded that poems are often called upon to help visualize events and thereby give a great deal of importance to imagery. Poems are also called upon to express word associations and musical quality, and by understanding the structure of the poem, the reader looks into the soul of the poet. In the end, I would like to entertain all of you by reciting a poem in which the poet has given special effects of words that really produce the sound of water which gushes out after a heavy rain. How beautiful is the rain! How beautiful is the rain after the dust and heat in the broad and fiery street in the narrow lane. How it clatters along the roofs like the tramp of hoofs. How it gushes and struggles out from the throat of the overflowing spout. Across the window pane it pours and swift and wide with a muddy tide, like a river down the gutters rose the rain, the welcome rain. Thank you.
Thank you.